It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, former Cabinet Minister and Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom. We're hoping to be joined shortly by Labour MP Barry Gardiner, the SNP's John Nicholson and Annabel Denham of the free market think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs. A dinner for Conservative MPs at a Westminster hotel last night.
I've been so busy doing DWP stuff, I don't know exactly what you're referring to. I saw
fines for the Downing Street parties.
I'm afraid I didn't see any of that. Thank you very much.
So Boris Johnson's colleagues may have moved on from Partygate, but have the public. The Prime Minister faces Keir Starmer at midday after the police hand down 20 fines for Downing Street lockdown parties. We'll bring you PMQs live at midday.
I have no plans to resign. I need to see this through.
It is unacceptable for him to go around, threaten, effectively in his letter to me, the jobs of thousands of other people, unless we say it's OK for him to break the law.
Go, go, hero!
Would the government's plans to crack down on fire and rehire have stopped P&O sacking 800 workers?
Move out the way now!
And we'll speak to the woman convicted of dangerous driving after that confrontation with environmental campaigners. Welcome to today's programme. As I say, we're hoping to be joined by the Labour MP Barry Gardiner. He has been delayed. We're going to start off with the 20 fines that are being issued by the Metropolitan Police to people for rule-breaking parties at Downing Street and Whitehall during various stages of lockdown and when COVID restrictions were in place. Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Metropolitan Police hiding behind rules by not identifying Partygate offenders. My opening question to the panel is, should those issued with fines, Andrea, be named?
I think the police report and investigation is still underway. The police are independent. It's not for politicians to tell them how to run it. And I certainly don't think it's for politicians to try and influence how they proceed with this.
They could, according to the report, actually name the people. I suppose there will be viewers watching the programme who think that people involved in breaking lockdown rules which were created at Downing Street and in Whitehall, should be named.
I'm absolutely sure there are plenty of people who think that, but the point I'm making is I do not think that it is right for politicians to try and influence police procedures. It is a very clear red line, I think.
Should they be named?
Yes, and we're getting mixed messages about this, aren't we? Because we've heard the Justice Secretary say already today that the Prime Minister will be named if he's one of those who...
Well, we always knew that Downing Street did say that they would name Boris Johnson. They would say Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, received a fine, and Simon Case, the senior...
Sure, just because Downing Street says something on a Monday doesn't mean that they'll keep to it on a Tuesday.
Well, that's a different matter.
We've also been told that if any minister is involved, that minister will be named as well. I think that it'll be almost impossible for them to keep the names a secret. They will come out in the end. But you make the absolutely valid point. These are people who made the rules. So, of course, since they made the rules, when they break the rules, we should know about it. And we were told for months by Boris Johnson that no rules had been broken, and we know now that that was untrue.
All right. Well, as you say, or rather, I think it was Andrea that said it first of all, we're waiting for more, possibly more fines to be issued by the Metropolitan Police. This is not all being done in one go. And in the meantime, there are questions to the Prime Minister about whether he misled Parliament. We'll talk to Andrea in just a moment about that. But Annabel, on that substantive question, should those issued with fines be named?
Well, I think fundamentally the law needs to apply equally no matter who you are. So if it is the case, and perhaps somebody on the panel can correct me here, that the fines are not being made public for members of the public who aren't involved in the government, who weren't involved perhaps in the decision-making process, then that ought to apply to these individuals here, perhaps with the exception of the Prime Minister and Simon King?
Well, I mean, normally, if somebody receives a fixed penalty notice for a traffic offence, and this is equivalent in that sense, their name isn't released unless they choose to challenge it in open court. So there is a difference or a distinction made, but it is, I suppose, about the politics of this particular issue. Welcome to you, Barry. You're forgiven. Just this once. Don't be late again. What about naming those issued with fines? Should they be named or not?
I think those who were responsible for making the law should be named. Those who were in senior positions inviting others to those parties should be named. I tend to agree with you that actually we are saying the law should be observed by equally by all, and therefore if the normal practice is not to name individuals, then on the whole those people who turned up at a party because their boss told them to, I don't think should be named.
Can I just draw your attention, Andrea, to the words the Prime Minister said on the 8th of December 2021, last year. This is to the House. I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and no COVID rules were broken. And that is what I've been repeatedly assured. I've asked the Cabinet Secretary to establish all the facts to report back as soon as possible. The Metropolitan Police has stated very clearly that rules were broken. They were rule-breaking lockdown parties, hence they are issuing these fines. Has the Prime Minister misled the House, inadvertently or not?
Well, what he said is he was assured. So in that sense, that is the fact, is he was assured. So what he's also said is he takes full responsibility for everything that went on. And it was the Prime Minister who called for the independent Sue Gray report precisely because people were challenging the assurances he'd received. So, I mean, obviously we'll hear what the Prime Minister has to say at PMQs today. But you know, what is really important is he called for this investigation by Sue Gray on the grounds of people saying to him that the assurances he'd received were wrong.
What's really important is, first of all, he said there were no parties. Then
he said he'd been assured that there was no rule breaking.
He said that later. First of all, he said there were no parties. Then he said he didn't attend them. And then when he did attend them, he said, well, I was assured that it wasn't a party. And then he said, well, I'm sure I was assured that all rules were followed. Now, I'm sorry, you haven't answered directly Jo's question, and that is, did he mislead Parliament? Clearly he did.
And if he misled Parliament, even inadvertently, we've had Cabinet Minister Dominic Raab saying that the Prime Minister didn't mislead the Commons, but at the time was speaking to the best of his knowledge and his understanding. The Ministerial Code states very clearly that, in this case, Boris Johnson should come back to the House and correct the record at the earliest opportunity. So again, on the basis of what we now know very clearly from the Metropolitan Police, would you accept that Boris Johnson has misled the House, even on the basis of what he was assured at the time?
I think that the Prime Minister won't break the Ministerial Code, and what I'm not going to call on him to do something because I'm not closely involved with that investigation. And indeed, Barry asserts all sorts of things that the Prime Minister said. I didn't hear the Prime Minister use the words you've used. It will be for the Prime Minister and his advisers to decide whether, in fact, he has inadvertently misled the House, in which case he will correct the record.
Andrea,
but what I want to say.
Andrea, sorry, can I just say, Andrea, we all heard him use these words. It's the wriggling.
Use which words, John?
It's
no, there's no wriggling.
Well,
no, because that is a very easy accusation. It's a very easy accusation to talk about wriggling. The fact of the matter is the Prime Minister, as Jo just read out, said he had been assured on multiple times that there was no rule breaking. If, in fact, there was rule breaking, that is to be established by the Gray report and the Metropolitan Police report that the Prime Minister instigated the Gray report.
All right,
we know, as do others.
All right, we know the Metropolitan Police has said there was rule breaking.
Yes.
I have used those words specifically from the 8th of December. But would you like to hear the Prime Minister come back to House and correct the record for misleading the House inadvertently then, as it looks?
I would never want any minister, I would not accept any minister misleading or inadvertently misleading the House. I would not accept anybody breaking the Ministerial Code.
Andrea says that the Prime Minister takes responsibility. This Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has never taken responsibility for anything in his life. He wriggles when he's under pressure. He smirks when he's under pressure. And in fact, can I just say that we saw Therese Coffey there, whom I like on a personal basis, going into a celebratory dinner last night of Tory MPs. I have to say this is the worst moment for them to be holding a celebratory dinner, pretending that she didn't know about the police fines. Now, that just treats people with disdain. She's a cabinet minister.
She's not here to
defend
herself.
You seriously think she didn't know about this?
Anyone would think you were an opposition politician, John. Well, all of your assertions there are merely assertions.
You think she didn't know about the police fines?
Well, hang on. She's not here, so we're not going to question her, John. Did you go to the party last night?
I did.
You did?
Yeah.
And what did you make of what Boris Johnson had to say?
Boris was, as you would expect for a party leader, talking about his record, his ambitions going forward, the changes he wants to make in levelling up the country.
Was it appropriate to have a party, though, in the midst of what we now call Partygate, when fines were being issued for lockdown parties?
Very importantly, what last night's dinner was about, it was not a party, it was a dinner.
Well,
and what we've had since OK, so you can call it a party because that's the word of the moment. We were having a dinner because since 2019 there has been very little opportunity for new MPs. There were over 100 new Conservative MPs. Many of them have felt that during the COVID lockdown, all of us, every single MP, was incredibly busy helping their constituents, trying to be at home in their constituencies. This was an opportunity to get people together. There have been several attempts to get people together, and they've had to be cancelled for various reasons.
Well, now we're talking.
Last night was merely a dinner for colleagues to be able to discuss.
Well, now we are talking
together.
About the dinner or the gathering, the party, whatever word we want to use last night. Perhaps you can confirm for us, because there have been reports about how Boris Johnson introduced everybody. I think he said, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, or as Keir Starmer would say, the leader of the Labour Party, to those who've been assigned male and female at birth. Did he make that joke?
He made a joke about... Yeah, he did make a joke. You know, it was light-hearted joke.
Totally appallingly bad taste.
Because?
In your opinion?
Well, I'm disturbed if you didn't think it isn't bad taste. Well, as a result of that, a Conservative Party backbencher has come out and said that they are trans, immensely bravely, has detailed some of the abuse that they've got.
Is it as a result of that, John? Do you know that?
Well, the timetable is curious if it's not. They came out immediately after this. And trans people have been subjected recently in the right-wing press, elements of the Conservative Party, but not just the Conservative Party, to appalling abuse. And the Prime Minister, as so often, gets the tone badly wrong.
Not correct at all. The Prime Minister, right from the dispatch box only last week, was talking about how absolutely vital it is that all trans people are treated with the maximum kindness and generosity. And if you look, which you're obviously determined to do, our colleague has been hugely supported by Conservatives, and we all gather round one of our own who's made a very, very brave statement in appalling circumstances, and I do not think it is right or fair that you should somehow suggest that the Prime Minister's light-hearted joke led to such a very, very serious statement from a good colleague.
It was done at Keir Starmer's expense. Would you agree, Barry, that this has been a difficult issue for the Labour leader too? And there have been complaints from within the party about the way he is speaking about and handling the issue of trans rights.
I think this is a very, very difficult debate for us all. And that's why I think we need much more kindness in the debate. That's why I also believe that making jokes about the issue, however well-intentioned, however flippantly done, actually is not appropriate. I think on both sides of the debate, people need to understand the concerns, the fears, the stress that different sides are going through here, and actually begin to listen to one another. So I think it's...
But is it becoming a political football, this issue?
That I think is exactly why we need to stop it becoming a political football. It has, you're absolutely right, it has become a political football. It's a desperately serious issue for those who have gender dysphoria. It's one that we have to understand and help and appreciate and do what Andrea says the Conservative Party has done for Jamie Wallace. And we would all want to see that. But equally, it's vital that people understand that women need safe spaces. They have fought for safe spaces for a very, very long time.
So do you have sympathy with your colleagues like Rosie Duffield who feel they are not supported by Keir Starmer?
Look, you're trying to make this a
No, I'm not trying to make it at all. I am quoting. I've had Rosie Duffield sit here many times in the studio. What I'm trying to establish is Keir Starmer in the right place, or handled this in a way that had made some of his female MPs feel comfortable or not?
I think we need to ensure that we, on all sides of this debate, that we make each other feel comfortable, and that means understanding their position, understanding what it is that is prompting them or motivating them to say what they do, and listening. And unfortunately, in party politics, as you know, very often listening goes out the window.
Annabelle?
Well, and we can talk about how divisive this might be in the Palace of Westminster, but do you think that the Labour Party is being sufficiently, or showing sufficient kindness and being sufficiently understanding of the emotions and the responses of women across the country who are starting to worry about single-sex spaces, who look at a Labour leader who it seems unable to define even what a woman is?
No, I don't think so. In fact, in fairness to Keir, I believe that last week he talked about the importance of single-sex spaces and of taking real care of people on both sides of the debate. Look, the point, I think, with the trans debate is this, and it is deeply emotive, and that's why most politicians tread very carefully when they speak about it. But I was given the female eunuch by Germaine Greer at the age of 14 by my mother. I learnt that male and female is what you're born with, but gender is learnt. It's a learnt attribute. It's something that you are socialised into. And therefore, I think when people say that they are transitioning, they're clearly transitioning from one thing to another. We have to respect that transition. We have to support them at all stages in that transition. But that does not mean that we don't support the people who may feel threatened in their safe spaces.
OK, we're going to do that because I know we have slightly moved off the agenda as set, which is good, but we're going to pick up now with the consultation launched by the government proposing enhanced compensation for employees who are fired from their jobs and then rehired on worse terms. You will remember, obviously, the scandal with P&O Ferries, who fired 800 workers, hired agency staff to replace them, who would earn an average of £5.50 an hour. P&O said that decision was necessary. It was done because the firm's survival was at risk. Let's listen to the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, talking about this yesterday.
P&O are quickly making themselves the pirates of the high sea. It is unacceptable for him to go around, threaten, effectively in his letter to me, the jobs of thousands of other people, unless we say it's OK for him to break the law. It's not OK, and I'll be coming to Parliament tomorrow and saying more about that.
Andrea, listening to that, it sounds as if Grant Shapps is wanting to make it illegal. That's not what's being proposed. It's going to make it more expensive for companies like P&O Ferries to break the law because they're going to have to compensate further. But that's it, isn't it?
Well, I think Grant has made absolutely clear how totally unacceptable what P&O have done is.
Well, I think there's broad agreement on that.
P&O have admitted themselves that they've broken the law in doing that there was no consultation, came out of the blue, and that they're not firing and rehiring. What they're doing is they're firing and getting in cheaper people on less than the living wage.
But is the government suggesting something that will outlaw that practice?
I mean, I'll wait to see what the proposal is, but it is already breaking the law, and what the government is intending to do is to make sure that anybody who is employed in the UK economic zone will be subject to the UK's minimum wage schedules, which means that what P&O have done in sacking a bunch of staff with no consultation, breaking the law, and then replacing them with people under the UK's minimum wage would also be breaking the law in the future. That's my understanding of it.
Barry, do you welcome the consultation on certainly increasing the compensation legally that companies like P&O would have to give employees that they sack in the way they did as a starting point?
Look, I of course welcome action that is in the right direction, but the question is it sufficient? Now, what the government is doing is announcing an enhanced code of conduct, an enhanced set of guidelines. Now, we've already got a company that is prepared to break the law because it believes the penalties in doing so do not outweigh the benefits.
Yes.
And therefore, simply saying to somebody, you know, the government, according to the code of conduct, doesn't think that this is a good thing, is not going to stop other companies from doing it.
No, absolutely.
What it's going to do is it's going to encourage the good companies who want to do the right thing by their workers to feel, well, actually, if we're being undercut by the cowboys, we have no choice. And that is why statute is so important.
Yeah, but even the bill, because you had a bill yourself, didn't you, along similar lines. But even your bill, which wasn't taken on board, said the practice of firing and rehiring on worse terms could only be used as a last resort. It didn't stop it altogether.
Yes, but that's not the point. What it would have stopped is precisely what I've said, and that is good companies feeling that they have to go down this route. And actually, my bill made provision for workers who had been fired without the proper steps being followed, which is the case here, being able to take out an injunction which restored their jobs. So my bill would have actually, even though it was about fire and rehire, would have actually stopped the fire part of this from happening.
All right. Is it sufficient, do you think, to stop what happened with P&O?
No, I don't think it will stop what happened with P&O, and these sorts of measures tend to come with all sorts of unintended consequences. It will incentivise companies to register boats overseas or to employ crew in other jurisdictions. More generally, firms may react by providing short-term contracts or zero-hours contracts. These sorts of measures don't tend to bring the benefits that politicians like to suggest that they might be. Generally speaking, increasing employment regulation disincentivises job creation. It doesn't help those who are out of work, even though it may provide better circumstances for some of those who are in work. Women and young people tend to be hardest hit by these sorts of measures. So the government needs to tread, I think, extremely carefully.
Women and young people are most hard hit by the gig economy, in which they have no job security, in which they can't get onto the housing ladder because they've got no capacity to know what their income going forward is going to be. They feel completely insecure in work. And actually, you know, if you look at sick pay in this country, and that is something that has, you know, we've just had 2 years of people going off sick, we get 19% of our average wage, or of our wage rather, in sick pay. In Germany, it's 100%. In Belgium, it's 98%. Why is it that a sick worker in the UK is worth only a fifth of a sick worker in Germany?
Annabelle?
What you're saying there about the situation for gig workers isn't borne out in extensive surveys that have been conducted. Most polling reveals that those who are working in the gig economy value flexibility and the control that they have over their working hours, their working patterns.
Have you spoken to somebody working in an Amazon fulfillment centre, as they call those warehouses? Have you spoken to somebody who's in that?
I personally haven't spoken to anybody working in an Amazon warehouse, but I have looked at the extensive surveys that have been conducted of gig workers. And it doesn't make sense that the government and the Labour Party are so opposed to what is essentially a form of employment that has allowed us to have a very flexible labour market that's created a lot of job opportunities and played an important role in the fact that our employment rate before the pandemic was at its highest ever level.
All right, John. Annabelle is absolutely right, and certainly what the government's employment rights bill will do is to make improvements to the gig economy without getting rid of it, because it really is incredibly valuable to some people to have that flexibility.
Right, the rhetoric is strong, John. You heard it there from Grant Shapps, but also Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister in Scotland, has said she would outlaw fire and rehire practices tomorrow if she had the power. Are you expecting any movement on that?
Well, I'd like to see the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government have that power. Listening to the boss, the High Headgeon of P&O, who spoke both to MPs and also MSPs, what struck, I think, many members was just the extraordinary arrogance that he had. He didn't seem at all embarrassed by having broken the law. He felt emboldened, I think, by the working conditions that so many workers have in this country. And, of course, flexible employment practices really is a euphemism often for poor employment practices.
I mean, this was a
where people are badly treated.
But this was a particularly unique case. There are plenty of examples of firing and rehiring on worse terms, but the idea of firing and not rehiring at all,
So,
and then
they are
undercutting,
rehiring. They're just not rehiring the
same workers
people,
because they have not made those posts redundant.
It was especially egregious example of this. You're right.
Absolutely, but there has been a large increase in the number of corporate insolvencies. The figure for January this year was more than double that of the same month last year. Admittedly, actually, the year before that it was similar. What are companies which face ruin, financial difficulty supposed to do?
Well, of course, you wouldn't think that looking at the chief executive's pay structure. Would you? He doesn't seem to be. He doesn't seem to be having to deal with any imminent poverty himself. I don't believe a word that he says. There's something gone badly wrong with his business model. If the only way that P&O can survive going forward is to hire people from out with this country on these appallingly low wage packets, something isn't working with the company.
In the real world, businesses do struggle, actually, from time to time. And also, in the real world, businesses do horrendous things and businesses act very well.
So
Obviously,
your point is?
Well, my point is that you are completely misrepresenting. This is bad behaviour by a company who claim to have very real financial difficulties, which may well be true.
I thought we were agreeing on that, Andrea.
What we do in the United Kingdom is we try to balance the rights of the workforce with the needs of employers to get through recessions and peak times and down times in order to have a balanced economy, which, as Annabelle rightly points out, is good for jobs in this country. It enables our economy to survive and to thrive. And to simply try and make all businesses are bad and all workers good, that it's far too simplistic. That is not how the world works.
First of all, thank you for explaining
You're
that.
very welcome.
To me.
That's woman-splaining,
But secondly, I didn't, of course, say that all businesses were bad, and it's ludicrous to deduce that from what I just said.
Good.
Finally.
Yeah, can I just pick up on what Andrea said? Because it seems to me that, yes, of course, everybody's agreed that what's gone on at P&O is wrong. But it went on at British Airways. It went on at British Gas. It went on at Go North West. It went on at Weetabix. It went on at Tesco's. It went on at Argos. It went on at Sainsbury's. It went on at Clark's Shoes. For goodness sake, how often does it have to happen to hundreds of thousands of workers in this country before your government will take action to stop it?
So are you saying, Barry, that all of the companies you've just listed did what P&O did?
No, I'm not. I'm saying that they fired and rehired, that they called workers in and they said, you're fired, and if you don't come back in tomorrow or the day after and sign a new contract that takes £15,000 off your wages, 10,000, 15, changes your shift pattern so you don't see your kids at the weekend, if you don't come in and do that, by that date, you're out. You're out in your ear.
And are you aware, Barry, that the government is changing that to make sure that that sort of activity, which is totally unacceptable, cannot continue?
All right, I'm going to give Annabelle the final word, then we must move on.
But can you accept, Barry, that recontracting may be necessary when there have been shifts in the market?
And my bill made that
obviously
clear.
is an egregious case, and I don't think anybody here would justify their behaviour. But the fundamental point remains that the alternative to sacking those 800 staff was not those 800 staff remaining on those same employment contracts. It was the company potentially going under.
Look,
now I'm going to have to stop it there. I'm sorry to hurry you all along. You may remember this. I'm about to show you the video, an extended piece of the video we saw in the headlines. The activist group, climate activist group Insulate Britain, who blocked roads over various points, particularly on M25, protesting for better insulated homes. Let's have a look at this.
I'm not joking, my son needs to get to school. Move out the way now. I'm trying to bring you there. My son is 11 and he needs to get to school. My son is 11, he needs to get to school and I need to get to work. So move out the way then.
Now, that was Sherilyn Speed, who was driving her son to school when she came across an Insulate Britain protest near the M25 in Essex last October. Two protesters, as you saw there, sat in front of the Range Rover, which she tried to use to move them out of the way. This week, she's pleaded guilty to dangerous driving and has received an interim driving ban while she waits for sentencing in May. She joins us now. Welcome to you, Sherilyn. Why did you do it?
why did I do it?
Yes.
I was really frustrated and I needed to get my son to school and I needed to get to work.
And it just overtook you in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really passionate about my son's education. And as I've explained before, like, I'm self-employed, I have my own businesses. If I don't go to work, I don't get paid. There's a bigger picture here, you know, and obviously I'm a single mum, as everyone knows, and I'm just trying to do my best, get to work, get to school, pay my bills, just like everyone else.
Do you accept that your actions could have caused quite serious harm to the protesters?
No, because I knew exactly what I was doing at the time. I didn't intend to hurt anyone. I didn't hurt anyone, and their statement says that they wasn't hurt and they didn't have to receive any medical attention.
Do you, right, and do you understand, you've talked about your strength of feeling, how passionate you are about your son's education. Do you also understand the strength of feeling and passion held by Insulate Britain protesters in the way that they did?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm not against them, I'm not against their cause. I just think the methods that they used were wrong. I don't think that the general public should have to suffer. I think that they wanted to get their point across, I understand that, but gluing your face to the floor and causing disruption like that to normal people who have already suffered. We've been through a pandemic. We've already lost out on a lot already. My son's had 18 months of school, like everyone else's children. You know, he just started secondary school as well. His anxiety obviously was going to be high about that. He needed to start secondary school.
Do you think you overreacted?
Yeah, of course. I deserve to be punished for how I reacted. I completely agree with that. I can hold myself accountable. I don't think I deserved a whole 12-month ban, considering that I wasn't going at excessive speed. I didn't hurt anyone. I've got no previous convictions. I've not even got points on my licence.
All right.
So what I think would have been fair is if the police had stuck to their words, what they said at the beginning, that it was careless driving. That's what I accepted.
All right.
And I would have got points and I would have gone on a driving awareness course and I would have had to pay a fine.
All right.
I accepted all of that.
All right, Sherilyn, you can obviously listen to the rest of the discussion. Barry, what was your reaction to the video itself?
A car is not a weapon, and a car should not be used in order to push people in that way. I think from what the lady has said about her actions, she's accepted that she was wrong, and I respect her for that. And I think all of us understand the tensions that one can have when you're trying to get kids to school. But the point is I think actually when the judge is passing sentence, it would be better that part of that sentence was that she and the protesters should be asked to sit down together, to talk to each other, to explain on both sides the tensions that are felt, and actually to get some understanding of each other's position. Because I do think it's really important that situations like this, we don't just vilify one side or say, well, they were in the wrong for sitting in the road or they were wrong for using the car. I think there are moments when we can, as a community, learn from what's gone on, if we actually understand the concerns of the climate protesters, as well as the disruption that it causes to people in their everyday life.
What was your reaction when you saw that clip, Annabelle?
Well, I mean, I agree with Barry. Clearly, she wouldn't have used her vehicle as a weapon, and I find it difficult to believe that she was completely in control and knew exactly what she was doing. I'm not sure that could ever be said of somebody driving a car into protesters. But I think the wider point here is about what the police were doing, or rather what the police weren't doing. Were they doing their job properly? Were they perhaps clear on what their powers were? Would this woman have felt the need to take matters into her own hands? Probably not. And I think, you know, the problem we seem to have with the police when it comes to protests is that they alternate between brutality, like we saw at the Sarah Everard vigil, and actually taking too relaxed approach and not stepping in when they ought to, as we see with the Insulate Britain protests.
I don't think we should get distracted by what the police were or were not doing. And the woman concerned, she says that she's sorry, but she didn't sound very penitent to me in the course of that answer. And my goodness, if her child was anxious before she ran our car towards the protesters, can you imagine the child's anxiety afterwards? There's too much road rage. There's too much rage in this country, first of all, and there's certainly too much road rage. It's getting worse all the time. And that screaming at the protesters followed by jumping back into the car and driving towards the protesters, is just absolutely appalling behaviour. And I'm glad she's lost her licence, because I think she should be away retraining and learning about being calm on the road, because lots of things happen on the road that make us all anxious and upset. And if that's the way you respond to it, then you shouldn't be in charge of a vehicle.
Sherilyn, did you want to respond to that?
I don't really know what to say to that, really. I mean, everyone's entitled to their opinion. Obviously, I was emotional on that day. There was a lot that I was going through personally, and I felt strongly about getting my son to school and getting to work.
All right.
I said that it was wrong. I've admitted that. But I didn't hurt anyone, and I didn't intend to go out that day to hurt anyone.
Yeah.
I've had my licence since I was 17. I've not got any points on my licence prior to this.
All right.
I've not ever been in trouble with the police. So clearly, for 35 years, I've been pretty calm on the road.
All right.
So I've never actually done anything like this before. So just on that day, that's how I felt.
Andrea, separate to this, we've talked about the Insulate Britain protests, and there were occasions when motorists were trying to get to hospitals or trying to reach family members in other parts of the country. Do you understand the strength of feeling of those motorists? And I'm not talking about this particular action.
Yeah, I mean, I'm completely very interested to hear what Sherilyn had to say, and I completely understand her frustration, and particularly for people running a business and trying to get kids to school. I don't think taking the law into your own hands is ever right. But in terms of your point about the frustration, yes, I do understand it. I mean, I'm a huge fan of insulation. In fact, just this evening, I'm meeting an insulation company to try and look at how we can get more homes insulated before the winter. So,
as an aside, yes.
Yeah, as an aside. But the point is that the goal I totally agree with, to insulate Britain, but the method has to not infringe other people's rights to go about their daily life. And that's where the limits of protest lie. I think, I completely believe in free speech, the right to protest, but what you can't do is go wrecking other people's lives. I mean, Sherilyn's one example. People were missing doctor's appointments, people were trying to get to weddings. It's unacceptable.
I'm going to interrupt at this point, say thank you to Sherilyn Speed for joining us, because we're going to pause just for one moment. Let's welcome viewers on the news channel. It's just under 10 minutes to midday, and Prime Minister's questions, if, of course, it starts on time. That'll be up to the Speaker, Lindsay Hall. Let's just dip into the chamber and see what's going on as MPs gather for the final clash at the dispatch box between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson before the Easter recess. We talked at the beginning of the programme about the dinner last night, a charm offensive, you might call it, by the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to try and reset his leadership, just as the Metropolitan Police is issuing fines for rule-breaking lockdown parties at Downing Street and Whitehall. Tory MPs were invited last night. Let's catch up with our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Laura, has it worked, the charm offensive, with those Tory MPs, some of whom, of course, had put in letters trying to trigger a vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister?
Well, Jo, I think to a degree, but I think that the efforts that Boris Johnson has made to change his team, to change some of his staff, to sack some of his staff, to employ extra ministerial aides, to try to improve communications between Downing Street and the backbenchers, I think some of that has had an impact, and I think backbenchers are feeling a bit more love from the top. I think, however, what is more realistic in terms of what's really changed the dial in terms of the pressure on him is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because quite understandably and quite properly, it is those dramatic global events that have really changed the dial in Westminster. That is what is sucking up the bandwidth in government, and particularly in Downing Street, and that is what has really changed the priorities of people in Parliament. But as we were reminded yesterday with the first batch of fines coming forward from the Metropolitan Police, this issue has not disappeared. It had faded, but has not been forgotten. And right now, we're in a sort of sense of, suspended animation, because we know that yesterday was the first day of the Met's official conclusions, but it certainly won't be the last. And I think it's not until we see the firm conclusions what actually it means for Boris Johnson, I don't think it's until then that the political implications will actually become clear.
Laura, it's interesting in terms of the dynamics at Westminster, particularly with the Conservative Party, as you say, and the war in Ukraine has obviously had a major influence. I don't know if we can show our viewers, and I'll read it to you, Laura, anyway, but it's from the pollster James Johnson, that perhaps the juxtaposition with what the public still feel about Partygate, as we call it, is much the same. He says the apparent nonchalance about Partygate in Parliament is very much not shared by the public. Still stand by what I said in January. If Tory MPs don't realise this, it's going to be an albatross around their necks come the general election, I should say.
Yes, and I was speaking to somebody who knows Boris Johnson very well yesterday, who has worked with him at very close quarters, and actually they were making that precise point. They were suggesting that when it gets to the general election in 2024, people are not likely to be voting at that stage based on what may or may not have happened in this big global power play between Vladimir Putin and the West. They would not be voting on however close Boris Johnson seems to be to President Zelensky from Ukraine. They will not be voting on those kinds of issues on foreign policy. They will be voting on the bread and butter issues that affect them. They will be voting likely on what looks like a pretty tough backdrop for people in terms of being able to make ends meet. And many MPs do worry and are aware, I think, that how they see it, that sort of thread between Boris Johnson and the public, what his backers would say was a sort of golden thread. You know, he was a politician who was able to bring in former Labour voters, new people to the Tory tribe in that election in 2019. And there are MPs who worry that that connection is perhaps not completely snapped, but it is certainly looking quite threadbare and has certainly been fractured over all of this. I mean, it's probably a good day to remind everybody what we talk about on this programme, what people discuss in this square mile, is not necessarily exactly what people are really talking about at their kitchen tables when they're thinking about what's going on in the world. That's not to say for a single second that the public isn't greatly concerned and hasn't paid attention to what's happening in Ukraine. But as James Johnson, the pollster, suggests, people have long memories, so the mess around Partygate may have faded for a while, but it hasn't been forgotten, and it did do damage to Boris Johnson's personal political brand. There's no question about that.
Well, Laura, you're staying with us up until Prime Minister's questions. Your reaction to what you just heard there from
I mean, I think Laura's right that the next general election will be fought on issues like the cost of living, like the party's record, and issues like what happened during lockdown will absolutely be in people's minds. And I don't underestimate the anger of lots of my constituents, but equally my constituents are very concerned about the cost of living, how we get through this, their energy bills, issues around planning, issues around enough houses, issues around school places. You know, people in South Northamptonshire, right around the country, are looking at a lot of different issues when they're looking at this government's track record.
Barry?
Laura's right about the public not forgetting these issues. She's wrong, I think, about the date of the next election. I believe the next election will be governed not by the five-year term, or it will be governed by when Boris Johnson thinks it's his best opportunity.
But every Prime Minister does that.
To save himself from his backbenchers. And that's why I think, because of all the problems with the cost of living that Andrew's just alluded to, and the pressure that's built up from his backbenchers, we're likely to see a general election probably at the end of this year or at the latest May next year, before the boundary changes have kicked in, which Conservative MPs actually aren't too keen on fighting under new boundaries, many of them. So I think the time frame that Laura's talking about is wrong. Boris Johnson will save Boris Johnson, not the Conservative Party, not the country. He'll save Boris Johnson.
I really don't agree with that, Barry. I don't agree with your assessment on timing. I don't agree that Conservative MPs don't like the boundary changes, and I certainly don't agree that Boris will do what's right for Boris. He really has a mission to level up across the country, and I think you only have to look at the seats won in the Red Wall seats in the north of England, in places where Labour voters turn to the Conservatives because they can see that Boris Johnson really does have a mission
Conservative
to try and
MPs
give better opportunities
don't
around
really
the
like
UK.
Boris Johnson very much when you talk to them, and they don't trust him. Trust will be the issue at the next election. And just let me finish this point, Andrea. Trust will be the most important issue at the next election, and people don't trust Boris Johnson with good cause. He's toxic in Scotland. And the Scottish Conservative Party will be in the extraordinary position with every single Scottish Tory MSP having called for his resignation. They'll have to go around the doors in Scotland and explain why they think he's the right man to lead the country forward.
Just before I go back to Laura, are you saying that this would be a good time to have a leadership contest when there is pressure on cost of living and a war ongoing in Ukraine?
Well, if I were a Tory MP, which is, I know, hard to imagine, I certainly would not want Boris Johnson to lead me into the next election because they know he's toxic and they know he'll do them a lot of damage in the ballot box.
But you are the SNP. You don't represent what Tory MPs think, of course, and know, do you?
No, but I do talk to a lot of Tory MPs.
I'm sure you do.
I'm sure you do.
Laura, what about Keir Starmer? What do you think he will focus on today? I think... Hang on, Laura, just... No, I think we've got a few moments. You can go ahead.
I think Keir Starmer might actually stay away from asking questions about Partygate and the surrounding mess.
I'm going to interrupt you now. Well, apologies. Let's see. Here he is.
And I know that the House stands with you and will give you the support that you need to live freely as yourself. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank Donna Ockenden and her whole team for the compassionate approach she's taken throughout this distressing review of maternity care at Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital's NHS Trust. Every woman giving birth has the right to a safe birth, and my heart, therefore, goes out to the families for the distress and suffering that they've endured. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will be making an oral statement this afternoon setting out the government's response. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While our focus is rightly on Ukraine, the Prime Minister will be aware of the great concern many people have across the Baltic states. So can he outline the role the Joint Expeditionary Force can play in countering Russian aggression and improving defensive posture for our allies in the Baltics?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much, and the Joint Expeditionary Force, or the JEF, is an increasingly important grouping of the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, the Dutch and ourselves, who are committed to working together in an active way to counter Russian aggression and to support our Ukrainian friends. And we had a very successful meeting a couple of weeks ago, and we'll have further such meetings in the course of the next few weeks.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by joining the Prime Minister in his remarks in relation to the honourable member for Bridgend? Does the Prime Minister still think that he and the Chancellor are tax-cutting Conservatives?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly do, because I certainly do, because this is the government that has just introduced not only the biggest cut in fuel duty ever, but the biggest cut in tax for working people in the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker. 70% of the population paying national insurance contribution will have a substantial tax cut as a result of what the Chancellor did. And if you take together, they don't like it, Mr. Speaker, it's true. They always put up taxes. That's why. We cut taxes. They love it. They love putting up taxes. But if you take together what we're doing with income tax and national insurance, it's the biggest tax cut proposed by my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for 25 years.
Keir Starmer.
Cut the nonsense and treat the British people with a bit of respect. Let me take him through this slowly. 15 tax rises, the highest tax burden for 70 years. For every £6 they're taking in tax rises, they're only handing £1 back. Prime Minister, is that cutting taxes or is that raising taxes?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't know where he's been for the last 2 years. But even by the standards of yes, he has. Even by the standards of Captain Hindsight, Mr. Speaker, to obliterate the biggest pandemic for the last century from his memory, to obliterate the 408 billion that we've had to spend to look after people up and down the country is quite extraordinary. And this is a government that is getting on with reducing the tax burden wherever we can. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, there's one measure I think he should be supporting, and that's the health and care levy, Mr. Speaker, to fund our NHS. That's the one they oppose, Mr. Speaker. Every other tax rise, they're all in favour of.
Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I can only hope that his police questionnaire was a bit more convincing than that. This year, British people face the worst fall in living standards on record. While they're counting every penny, the Prime Minister is hitting them with higher taxes. But in 2024, when there just so happens to be a general election, they will introduce a small tax cut. That's not taking difficult decisions. It's putting the Tory re-election campaign over and above helping people pay their bills. How did he find a Chancellor as utterly cynical as he is?
Prime Minister.
What we have, Mr. Speaker, is a Chancellor who took the tough decisions to look after the UK economy throughout the pandemic, who protected people up and down the land with £408 billion worth of support, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, if we listen to them, if we listen to Captain, this is the truth. If we listen to Captain Hindsight, we would not have come out of lockdown in July last year, Mr. Speaker. We would have stayed in lockdown over Christmas and New Year, Mr. Speaker, with the result that the UK economy would not be growing in the way that it is, and so we would not be able to make the investments that we now are. And under Labour, we would have to tax more and borrow more, and they cannot be trusted, Mr. Speaker, with the economy.
Keir Starmer.
The tough decisions. Give me a break. We know, Mr. Speaker, we know who those two always ask to pay. Income stealth tax, a tax on working people. Tuition fee raid, a tax on working people. National insurance hike, a tax on working people. All while oil and gas companies see unexpected bumper profits. A windfall tax would raise billions and ease the burden on working people. Mr. Speaker, the former CEO of BP, Lord John Brown, says a windfall tax is justifiable. The current CEO says they have, in his words, more cash than they know what to do with. Why is the Prime Minister more interested in shielding oil and gas profits than supporting working people?
Mr. Speaker, it's a classic example of what Labour has got wrong in their period in office. The oil and gas companies are now investing £20 billion, Mr. Speaker, in ensuring that we have long-term energy supplies. And I remember the 1997 Labour manifesto actually said that there was no economic case for more nuclear power. We are now having to make good the historic mistakes of the Labour Party by investing in our long-term energy supply. That is what we're doing. Everything that they are proposing would mean deterring investment, meaning higher prices for consumers and households up and down the land being worse off.
Speaker, there we have it. They're the party of excess oil and gas profits. We're the party of working people. Mr. Speaker, talking of parties, Prime Minister, he told the House no rules were broken in Downing Street during lockdown. The police have now concluded there was widespread criminality. The Ministerial Code says that ministers who knowingly mislead the House should resign. Why is he still here?
Hang on a minute. change his position. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we do at least expect some consistency from this human weather vane. It was only a week or so ago where he was saying that I shouldn't resign. He's got to make what is his position, Mr. Speaker? The investigators must get on with their job. But in the meantime, In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we are going to get on with our job. And what we are focusing on is tackling the cost of living, helping people through the spike in fuel prices, the 9.1 billion that the Chancellor has set out. But also, Mr. Speaker, I've mentioned nuclear power, I've mentioned tackling our energy supplies, which Labour totally failed to deal with. What we're also doing, far more important perhaps even than that, Mr. Speaker, we're tackling illiteracy and innumeracy in our schools. And I think we're investing billions in tutoring, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're focusing on, and I think that's what the people of this country want us to focus on.
Here's Starmer.
Look, there are only two possible explanations. Either he's trashing the ministerial code, or he's claiming he was repeatedly lied to by his own advisers and that he didn't know what was going on in his own house and his own office. Come off it. He really does think that it's one rule for him and another rule for everyone else. That he can pass off criminality in his office and ask others to follow the law. That he can keep raising taxes and call himself a tax cutter. That he can hike tax during a cost of living crisis and get credit for giving a bit back just before an election. When is he going to stop taking the British public for fools?
Mr. Speaker, this is the leader of the opposition who would have kept this country in lockdown and made it absolutely impossible. He has zero consistency on any issue, Mr. Speaker. But one thing we know about is he would like to take us back into the EU and take us back into lockdown if he possibly could. Thanks to what this government has done, we have unemployment back down to the levels it was before the pandemic. The economy bigger than it was. We have record vacancies, Mr. Speaker. The difference between them and us is they want to keep people, Mr. Speaker, they want to keep people on benefits. We want to help people into work. And that's what we're doing in record numbers. They want to raise taxes. We want to cut taxes. And that's what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. And we're tackling illiteracy. They didn't give a damn, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with making this country the best place to invest. Last time I updated the House, Mr. Speaker, on the number of unicorns that we had of unicorns in this country. That's tech countries worth more than $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. I said we had 100. I can inform you now, Mr. Speaker, that we now have 120. They don't want to hear it, but let me tell you, that's more than France, that's more than Germany, that's more than Israel, it's more than France, Germany, Israel combined, Mr. Speaker. That's what's happening under this government. That's what's happening because of the tough decisions we've taken. We take the tough decisions, we deliver, they play politics, Mr. Speaker.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK government's work connecting rural areas like Brecon and Radnorshire to superfast broadband is going to become a lot harder tomorrow when the Welsh Government withdraws its matched funding for the scheme, forcing the cost for installation back onto homes and businesses in my constituency. Welsh Labour's decision means that my constituents will lose out as local authorities in England continue to fund the scheme. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that broadband is critical for the growth of the rural economy? And will he double his government's efforts to connect my constituents despite Welsh Labour letting us down?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and we're spending £69 million already to support rollout of superfast broadband in Wales, and I wish that the Welsh Government had not withdrawn its broadband scheme, but we will do our best, Mr. Speaker, to make up the difference as fast as possible.
We now come to the SNP leader, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's good to see the member for Bridgend in the chamber this afternoon. I commend him for his statement earlier today. Mr. Speaker, last night, millions of families will have been desperately trying to figure out how they will possibly afford the £700 energy price hike that will hit them this Friday. Mr. Speaker, at the very same time, Tory MPs were gathering across the street for a champagne bash in the Park Plaza. We all know that the Tories partied during lockdown and now they're...
Mr. Fabricant, Easter is upon us. I don't need you to ruin your Easter. So let's hear, all of you, SNP leader Ian Blackford.
You can shout and scream when we're raising the Tory cost of living crisis, Mr. Speaker. Because we all know that the Tories partied during lockdown and now they're partying through the cost of living emergency. Last week, the Chancellor got it badly wrong with the Spring Statement. And ever since, the Prime Minister has been busy briefing against him, saying that more needs to be done. For once, I agree with the Prime Minister. So, if the Prime Minister really believes that more needs to be done, can he tell us exactly what he will order his Chancellor to do to help the millions of families who are facing a £700 price hike this Friday?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank him very much, and I think he's in error in what he says about events last night, but he is, like me, a living testament to the benefits of moderation in all things, Mr. Speaker. And I can assure him that we are getting that this week, for instance, to get to his point, what's happening actually is that the living wage is going up again by record amounts, and thanks to what the Chancellor has done, we are putting £9.1 billion into helping people up and down the country. And what I might respectfully suggest is actually, I think the Scottish Nationalist government, with whom, as I say, we work increasingly well, I think the thing they could focus on for the long-term prosperity of Scotland is the educational system, where I'm sad to see Scotland's once glorious record falling behind.
Ian Blackford.
What a load of absolute baloney. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is dangerously out of touch. Food banks are warning that people are having to choose their food based on whether they can afford the gas to boil it. Families are having to choose what rooms to heat or whether they can turn on the heating at all. Some in the Tory cabinet clearly believe that better weather means that they can happily sit on their hands and do nothing till next winter. They obviously don't get or don't care that in many parts of Scotland the weather will barely reach above freezing over the next week. The Chancellor thinks his £200 loan, which is forcing people into energy debt, is somehow a solution, but it clearly isn't. So before the Prime Minister and his Chancellor go off on their Easter holidays, will they at very least turn this loan into a grant and finally put some cash into people's pockets when they need it right now?
Prime Minister.
I thank him, but of course we are doing everything that we can. The 9.1 billion, the cold weather payments, and he's right to draw attention to the problem, Mr. Speaker. And we are making a huge investments in supporting people right now, and another £1 billion, by the way, through the Household Support Fund to help vulnerable families. But Mr. Speaker, when he talks about the cost of energy in Scotland, how absolutely preposterous that the Scottish Nationalist Party should still be opposed to the use of any of our native hydrocarbons in this country, with the result that we actually have to that the Europeans are importing oil and gas from Putin's Russia, Mr. Speaker. It's totally absurd. It's true.
Just for the record, it's National Party. Let's go to Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following on from the publication of the school's white paper, one of my most important campaigns is to secure provision of quality post-16 education within the Bolsover constituency, where there is currently none. Young people in my constituency have to travel long distances at considerable cost to access their education. Will my right honourable friend meet with me to discuss how we can right this wrong for the young people of the Bolsover constituency and give them the education that they deserve?
Prime Minister.
Yes. I thank him very much, and he's a great champion for Bolsover and for his constituents. Free and subsidised travel is provided to Bolsover students travelling so far to 2 of the 3 excellent colleges that are going to be offering T-levels from 2023. But I will make sure that he gets a meeting with my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, to discuss further what we can do.
Ed Davey.
During the Second World War, my grandmother, like countless other people across our country, opened her home to evacuees, including 2 German Jewish boys. Over 70 years later, the British people want to shelter desperate refugees again. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to refugee families on the Ukrainian-Polish border at Medica. Some desperately wanted to come to our country. One elderly couple told me, however, they'd been told that it was just too complicated. Now the government's own figures say the same. Paperwork is being put ahead of people. Mr. Speaker, when wealthy businessmen from over 50 countries can come to the UK visa-free, why does the Prime Minister insist that a traumatised Ukrainian mother and child must first fill out a visa form?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think I'm thank him very much, and he's right about the generosity of his country, and he's right to draw attention to his own family's generosity in this matter. Everybody, I think, is pulling together. The number of people who have come forward to offer their homes is incredible. But I really don't think that he should deprecate what the UK is offering. We've already given 25,000 people have already got visas, Mr. Speaker. We are processing 1,000 a day, and there is no limit, there is no upper limit to the number that we can take. And this is a country that has already been the most generous in taking people from Afghanistan, the 15,000 under Operation Pidding, 104,000 applications from the Hong Kong Chinese. This is a country that is overwhelmingly generous to people coming in fear of their lives from... Yes, it is, Mr. Speaker, and so is this government.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't think anybody involved in partnering operations over the last 10 or 20 years can fail to be humbled by the extraordinary courage and commitment of the Ukrainian people in defending their country, aided and abetted by the lethal aid from this country, of which they're all appreciative of this government and this Prime Minister being first out the door to deliver that. But would the Prime Minister agree with me that whilst others may now begin to tire, now is actually the time to double down on the aid that we give to Ukraine, that actually we might end up breaking a pretty poor Russian army and bring peace to that part of the world whilst consigning the likes of Vladimir Putin to the dustbin of history where he belongs?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that is absolutely right. Thank him very much. I thank him for his own bravery in going to see for himself only the other day. But, Mr. Speaker, yes, it is right that we should double down on military defensive support in the way that we are. And by the way, can anybody imagine a Labour government, eight of whose front bench voted to get rid of our nuclear deterrent? Can you imagine? Yes, they did. Can you imagine recently? Can you imagine them doing the same? We will go on with that, Mr. Speaker. But what we will also do, and I hope we have the support of the opposition in this, is make sure that there is no backsliding on sanctions by any of our friends and partners around the world. In fact, we need now to ratchet up the economic pressure on Vladimir Putin, and it is certainly inconceivable that any sanctions could be taken off simply because there is a ceasefire, Mr. Speaker. That would be absolutely unthinkable, in my view.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Households are experiencing soaring energy costs. We're in the middle of a global climate emergency. Against this backdrop, Norway can feed energy into our national grid at a cost of £1.36 per megawatt hour. France pays 17 pence per megawatt hour. Germany, the Netherlands and Luxembourg pay nothing to feed into our group. Can the Prime Minister then explain why Scotland's renewable sector has been punished with grid connection charges of £7.36 per megawatt hour?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Scotland's renewable sector is leading the world I'm grateful to all the Scottish Government for all the help and support that they are giving in developing that incredible resource in the North Sea. I think that there is also a role, by the way, for hydrocarbons as we transition, Mr. Speaker. But what we need to do is make sure that we have a grid. We have a grid that enables us to take that electricity onshore and transmit it around the country. And that is what I will be setting out in the British energy security strategy, Mr. Speaker. That is the investment, the long-term investment that this country needs, and which the parties opposite completely failed to address.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, following a huge resident and parish council-led campaign, the planning application for a new mega prison in my constituency was refused. But would my right honourable friend agree that with the proposals for that site being very close to where HS2 and East West Rail cross, this is a matter of fairness whereby communities already suffering at the hands of the construction of big state infrastructure should not be asked to take more? And will he instruct the Ministry of Justice not to appeal this planning decision?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, who's a doughty campaigner for his constituency. He's made an important point about a planning matter about which I don't think I should really comment, but I'm sure that the relevant ministers will have heard him loud and clear.
Eric Linden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the government losing an estimated £4 billion to fraud in the furlough scheme, surely the Prime Minister should have tackled that fraud, especially when, in his own party, in North Tyneside, furlough was claimed for a member of party staff, even though he continued to work.
Prime Minister.
If she's really saying, Mr. Speaker, that we should not have rolled out the furlough scheme at the speed that we did, then I think everybody in this country understands that it was a heroic thing. And I remember 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, they were yammering and clamouring for us to go faster. And we did, Mr. Speaker. We produced a fantastic scheme. And yes, fraudsters will be hunted down. We put another 100 million into tracking down fraud in this country. £23 billion a year were lost under Labour in fraud.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I was delighted to learn this week that 37 of the 39 state schools in Bracknell constituency are now graded good or outstanding. Will the Prime Minister join with me in thanking our fantastic teachers, staff, governors and pupils? And does he agree that the new Education White Paper offers a blueprint for our schools that we can all be proud of?
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a fantastic white paper.
Evans.
Mr. Speaker. Over 2 million tonnes of edible food is wasted on farms and factories every year, and funding was introduced in 2019 to cover the costs of getting food to charities to reach those in need. However, the Prime Minister will know his government have now cut that critical funding to zero. Mr. Speaker, funding for food waste diversion helps support community projects like, for example, Three Hills Community Supermarket in Glasgow. So can the Prime Minister explain why he is ignoring calls from Feeding Britain, Good Food Scotland and Fair Share to continue this worthwhile initiative and instead cutting off a lifeline to those struggling with the cost of living crisis?
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. I think he's referring to the strategy that we have for food waste. As far as I know, we continue to support it, but I will be happy to update him by letter.
Lucy Allen.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his earlier remarks concerning the Donna Ockenden report into avoidable maternity deaths and injuries at the Shrewsbury and Telford Hospital Trust. The report makes for devastating reading, the more so because women's voices were ignored. My constituent Hayley Matthews begged staff for a C-section throughout her 36-hour labour, but was forced into a natural birth. Her son Jack arrived blue and floppy, and within hours of his birth he tragically died. Will the Prime Minister join me in offering heartfelt sympathies to all the families affected, and also grateful thanks to the 1,862 women who shared their experiences with the Ockenden Review to ensure that maternity care is safer, kinder and more compassionate for the women that come after them.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her question. I think everybody will thank the women concerned for taking up the issue in the way that that they have, and will extend our heartfelt sympathies to the victims and their families for what they've suffered. It is very important that people get the answers that they deserve, Mr. Speaker, but also that we have the right approach to this issue in the future. And that's why we're investing very substantially in maternity services, and also, of course, very substantially in midwives and in our NHS altogether.
Sir Chair.
Thank you. Prime Minister, every day I hear from more and more of my Rotherham constituents who are struggling to put food on the table, to keep their lights on, to fuel their cars. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates the government's measures will only offset falling living standards by a third. This is the biggest financial squeeze since the 1950s. Prime Minister, don't blame Ukraine, don't blame COVID. This is down to your government's policies and your political choices. Sleep at night.
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree that people are facing a very tough time at the moment, and we've got to do everything that we... I don't agree with her analysis, but I think that the causes are certainly to do with the inflationary impact of the world coming out of COVID, and the energy price spike is at the root of it. And what we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is to help people with a universal credit, which we've lifted by £1,000, help people with the living wage, which is going up now by a record amount, Mr. Speaker, and cutting taxes on working people in the way that we are. But of course we can't do everything, Mr. Speaker, right now. And what we will do is ensure that we have a stronger economic performance, and we have people in work. And the most important thing is that we have people getting into work now in a way that wasn't possible, certainly wouldn't have been possible if we'd stuck to the policies that were proposed by the Labour opposition. And that's why we have a strong economy, and that is the best recipe. Better to be off benefits and into work, and that's what we're doing.
Neil Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my earliest campaigns was to reopen Stafford's Shire Hall, so I'm delighted that this iconic building is finally set to reopen this summer. So can I thank the government for providing £1.6 million in funding to create a hub for small businesses in the Shire Hall. But can I also ask my honourable friend to help regenerate the rest of Stafford Town Centre and our high streets to help level up the West Midlands and support our local businesses?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for her fantastic work to reopen Shire Hall. She's a passionate campaigner for Stafford, and Stafford was awarded over £14 million lately, Mr. Speaker, through the Future High Streets Fund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency has one of the highest rates of child poverty in the entire country, with too many already struggling between heating and eating. The government's recent real terms social security cut will now push even more families, children and pensioners into desperation. Does the Prime Minister agree that the biggest squeeze in household finances since records began does not come out of the blue, but is due to conservative economics and the notion that while some have the pleasure of partying, the rest of us should suffer?
That's right. Prime Minister.
No, Mr. Speaker, we're absolutely dedicated to levelling up across our entire country and making sure that we reduce poverty, and that's why I'm proud that there are now 500,000 fewer kids actually in workless households, 200,000 fewer kids, 200,000 fewer in poverty, Mr. Speaker, and 1.3 million fewer in absolute poverty. And the way we've done that, the way we've done that, Mr. Speaker, is by helping people into work. And we're going to go further, investing in more work coaches, massively increasing our training budget so that people get the skills that they need. That's our approach, Mr. Speaker, helping people by getting them into work.
Sir Robert Butland.
Mr. Speaker. today's announcement by our serving United Kingdom judges of their withdrawal from the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal is now the right decision, and I support it, as does my right honourable friend. Does he agree with me that on this sad day for the people of Hong Kong, and at a time when the international rule of law is under unprecedented challenge, it is for us here in Britain to stand up for what is right, to be resolute in the face of tyranny, and to make sure that the international rules-based order is defended at every opportunity.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and I know how passionately he's campaigned on this issue himself, and I can tell him that, and I want to thank the judges in Hong Kong's court for everything that they've been doing, but I think that they've evidently concluded that the constraints of the national security law make it impossible for them to continue to serve in the way that they would want. I appreciate and I understand their decision. It is vital that we all continue to make our points to the Chinese, as I did in my conversation with President Xi the other day, about freedom in Hong Kong and about the treatment of the Uyghurs, and we will continue to do that.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Gas and electric prices and bills are through the roof. The just about managing are no longer managing, coming to surgeries, queuing at food banks. Last week, the government had a golden opportunity to tackle this. Why the devil didn't they take that opportunity to do something and relieve the pressure on our constituents?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the pressure that people are under, but the best thing we can do, rather than endlessly taxing more and borrowing more, is make sure that we support people through this tough time, which we are, but also ensure that we have a strong and growing economy in which we get people into work. So we're cutting the cost of energy, but we're also taking the long-term decisions, which the party opposite failed to do, to invest in our energy for the future.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, today's updated government figures show that of 28,300 applications submitted under the sponsorship scheme by people displaced in Putin's war, just 2,700 have been processed. Could my right honourable friend please tell the House how many to date of those people have actually arrived in the United Kingdom? And will he give his support to my noble friend Lord Harrington to cut through the Home Office red tape, simplify the application process, and get people into the country?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're processing 1,000 a day, and I think that the country, 25,000 visas have already been issued. As I just told the House, Mr. Speaker, almost 200,000 families, homes have opened their arms to Ukrainians coming in fear of their lives, and there is no limit on the scheme, Mr. Speaker. I think we can be incredibly proud of what the UK is doing.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at that point. You can continue watching on BBC Parliament. Let me welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live for the programme. For the Government, Victoria Prentice, Environment Minister, Andrew Gwynn for Labour Shadow Public Health, and Laura Kuenssberg, the BBC's political editor. Laura, the last one before the Easter break, before MPs go off for recess. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, keen to press the bruise as to whether or not Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, following on from the spring statement last week, can claim the mantle of being tax-cutting politicians.
That's right. And for some time, actually, Labour's main attack on the government, irrespective of other political noise, has been about the issue of people being able to make ends meet. Now, last week, we talked a lot about Rishi Sunak's spring statement. He came forward with what many of his critics saw as simply not enough help for people who are struggling at the moment, but with a big political claim and a big political promise to cut tax. Now, Keir Starmer might have been critical of that in any case, because he would probably want to do different things with the public budget. But what he was really trying to go at with Boris Johnson today is this suggestion that actually that political claim is misleading, because it is the fact that actually under this government, taxes have been going up and up and up and are going to hit a historic high in terms of proportion of what's actually being taken in by the Treasury in terms of the overall economy. But what the government have is an aspiration to cut tax, and Rishi Sunak has made this promise that he will cut income tax before the next election. But what Labour are trying to do is essentially suggest that Boris Johnson and his Chancellor are being disingenuous about what they're really up to. And he was trying to tie that to a broader critique of Boris Johnson. Essentially, you say one thing, you're doing another, and you're not being straight with the public.
Well, Victoria, that is true, isn't it? An aspiration is not the same as reality.
Well, I think, as Laura said, Rishi gave a very clear promise that we would try to cut tax very hard. Well, we would cut tax in 2024.
But at the moment, you are raising taxes. You are not cutting them.
We have inherited a really, really difficult situation from the pandemic. Rishi had to act in a way during the pandemic with furlough, for example, which was referenced by several people during PMQs, that government didn't expect to have to do, didn't want to do, but needed to do in order to keep the country working. That worked, and I think it's really important that we remember that the mass unemployment that we were fearing as a result of the pandemic has not come to pass.
Well, that is true, Victoria, but can I just draw your attention to a line from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, because they contest your point that it is down to the COVID pandemic or even the war in Ukraine. They say the rising tax burden is not purely or even primarily a response to COVID. Boris Johnson had announced an end to austerity in 2019. There were already various pressures to spend more, including to provide more healthcare for an ageing population, to meet the net zero pledge and to achieve the levelling up agenda. So tax rises look likely even before COVID. Do you accept that?
Well, it's a really difficult balance, and you could see with Keir Starmer's questioning that it's difficult for the Labour Party too. On the one hand, you want to cut taxes, and of course, as politicians, we want a smaller state, particularly as Conservative politicians. Yeah. But on the other hand, you get all these calls for greater help to people. Very rarely described as spending help, but that's what it means. So this is a really hard balance for any politician.
I understand that, but actually, Sarah Champion, the Labour MP, said at the end, don't blame COVID, don't blame the war in Ukraine. Is it important for Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak to be honest with people about what they're doing in the way that you've explained? Because of the pressures, they are increasing taxes, not cutting them.
I think it's really important that we are transparent about what choices need to be made. But I did think in Rishi Sunak's statement last week, he was very clear that we do not want to increase borrowing. We need to keep borrowing under control. And the reasons for that is because we don't want to tax people more.
Right. And
I felt that did make sense. It made a lot of coherent sense. To me, these are not easy times. That we've had COVID, we've now got a war.
But they are choices. They are choices that could be made. And
I think that Rishi is very much making responsible, careful choices and making sure that he targets help at the lowest paid and at people who need it most, which I think is definitely the right thing to do.
On the question of more borrowing, that's what Labour would have to do, wouldn't it, in terms of the policy of wanting to give households £600, so nearly double what the government is proposing through various schemes, because the windfall tax that you've proposed would only raise £3.7 billion, covering the figure, say, about £200 of that. You'd borrow the rest.
Well, clearly, we have made a commitment that we would give households £600. The Shadow Treasury team have costed that up. I'm not sure that those figures that you cite are necessarily
It wouldn't all be covered by the windfall tax, which would be a one-off, fundraising measure of about £3.5 billion.
But politics is about priorities, and we have made a very firm commitment there because of the cost of living crisis. The government's in a really awful mess here. It's a perfect storm in many ways, because you've got inflation going up, you've got oil prices going up at the pumps, you've got energy costs going up, wages aren't going up by anything like the cost of living.
So you would borrow substantially to meet those difficulties?
And that is causing a major crisis, but it will also cause a crisis for the government because borrowing costs go up as well. So, look, we've got to tackle this.
How?
Well, we've said windfall tax, £600 off the energy bills. Yeah. That is a commitment that Labour has given. We want the government to do that.
All right, yes, and you would borrow to do that. Is that responsible?
It absolutely is responsible to cut the cost of living for people now.
And that's the issue. It's a timing issue as much as anything else, isn't it, Victoria? Because what are people going to do between now and the autumn when we sort of expect Rishi Sunak to have to come back to the Commons to help people out because the cap on energy prices is going to rise further? What do people do now when they are faced with hundreds of pounds in increased bills?
Well, we have to keep very much in touch with the reality of the situation and make sure that we target help.
More help.
Where it's most needed. Well, one of the really useful things we found during the pandemic when I chaired a task force called Food for the Vulnerable was that direct and targeted help via local authorities, which has been done by Rishi last week.
Well, he doubled it, didn't he? He doubled it to £1 billion. Yeah, to £1 billion to local authorities.
We found, as a committee and as a group that was working specifically on people who couldn't access food for whatever reason, we found that that sort of targeted support was the most useful. And I'm really pleased that the government has continued to get the learning that we took from that awful time during the early part of the pandemic and has doubled down, literally, that finance and that help. Local authorities often know who are the most in need in their communities.
But, Minister, isn't the point about this moment is it's not some kind of temporary emergency or some kind of crisis that suddenly hit like the pandemic? This is a situation where we may have inflation at 7, 8, 9, maybe even hitting 10% over a period of many months. And people who are perfectly used to being able to manage every month, maybe even being able to put a bit of money by, they're not going to have the cash to live in the way that they believe they're entitled to do so. And I'm not talking about luxuries, it's talking about people getting by week to week. And those kinds of things you're talking about, targeted funds for the very, very needy, that's just not going to cut it, is it? And isn't the risk for the government? You say you want to keep in touch. Last week, the Chancellor didn't look like he was in touch at all, your critics would say.
Well, I do think he's making the right choices, just as he did with furlough at the beginning of the pandemic. These are hard choices. Nobody's pretending that there are easy answers here. There really aren't. But what we have to do, and we as a Conservative government have to do, are continue to be fiscally responsible, and I think we are. Keep our eye on borrowing, which we know that with another party in charge would possibly not be so carefully done, and make sure that those who need help are getting it. The Chancellor's tried to do that with his work on energy. He's tried to do that again with the Household Support Fund.
But if the priority then, as you said, which is a legitimate political choice, it's the same kind of choice that George Osborne made, which is to try and keep a lid on borrowing, perfectly legitimate that you would say to make that decision. What then do you think people see from the optics of Rishi Sunak closing his spring statement, flourishing a promise of a tax cut in a couple of years' time? Because I think for many of your colleagues too, actually, that kind of jarred. There could have been a very sober statement saying you've got to keep a lid on borrowing, it's going to be tough, but I promise you that these are the right choices to make. But at the end of it, there was suddenly this giveaway. Don't you think that jars?
As you've set out, Laura, we are in really difficult times at the moment. I don't think any of us, when we had the last election, anticipated anything like the pandemic or indeed this awful war. But we have to continue to make sensible, responsible choices.
But was that one? But was that a sensible choice?
Yeah, we're still Conservatives. Right. We want people to keep more of their own money, spend more of their own money. Of course we do.
Right. Well, are you against the principle of cutting people's income tax?
Absolutely not. But look, I don't think a promise of jam tomorrow cuts it with people right now who are really feeling the squeeze. Now, to come back to Victoria's point about targeted support, the problem that the government has got is that more and more people are going to be dragged into that targeted support. People who, as Laura says, are actually have been reasonably comfortable, well off, with good wages and a good standard of living until very recently. And they are now struggling. So it's not just people who have been using food banks for the last 10 years or so. It's a whole new tranche of people that are being dragged into real financial difficulties. And that really worries me, because a lot of the support services that they would expect to be there by the state have been stripped away over the past 10 years or so.
Andrew, the flip side of that, though, is a lot of our viewers today, a lot of people watching last week might quite like the idea of getting some of their money back. And when it comes to the next election, actually, you've got quite a sticky wicket, haven't you? Are you going to say, no, you can't have that cash back that the other lot have already promised you?
Well, let's see where we are at the next election. They're still potentially 2 years away. We will have our own tax and spending proposals there. But look, I'm not sure that here and now people are thinking, well, in 2 years' time we might get a penny off income tax. What they're worried about is the cost of the fuel at the pumps. What they're worried about is the cost of the supermarket weekly shop. They're worried about how they pay their rent. These are real pressures here and now. The promise of jam tomorrow in 2024 that might not even materialise because of the economic situation in 2024. We don't know what it's going to be like in reality.
Well,
so let's see.
Well, let's talk about the war in Ukraine and the refugee crisis, because Victoria here in the studio has taken in a young woman, a young Ukrainian. I think we can show you the picture from the Daily Telegraph. It was from a few days ago there. First of all, tell us who the young lady is.
She's called Vika. She's 25. She's an extremely capable young woman who my daughter got to know. My daughter worked in Kiev until Christmas. And we're very, very pleased to have her, and we feel very lucky to have her living with us for the foreseeable future.
But one of the main criticisms has been about the bureaucracy, about the number of applications not being matched with the number of visas issued to people who would like to move in with a family here in the UK. Let's just have a listen to Lord Harrington of Watford, Minister for Refugees, talking about this issue.
There's been some talk, quite correctly in my view, that the visa application process is the actual filling it out is too slow. I agree with that. I sat down on Saturday morning and spent just under an hour filling one out myself, and I was sitting comfortably with a cup of tea rather than being a refugee in not in the Ukraine but in Poland, etc. We are going through every step of trying to shorten that form.
Should you just get rid of the visa application form?
Well, I think the system is being refined and improved all the time. When I think back to the first days of the war a month ago, we've come a very long way. We were talking then about mandatory TB tests for refugees before they entered, which the Home Office was pleased to waive as a first step. When we filled in Vika's application form, that was a far more onerous and difficult process than the current situation. I know that Lord Harrington, who I'm really pleased to see in post and very much...
But even he's saying it's difficult.
I know that he is all over the application process, and I am sure that further improvements will be made as we learn how to run what is completely
except, of course, as you
system.
know, there are tens of thousands of people waiting to come to the UK.
Absolutely,
there are families ready to accept them in the way that you have.
It is important that we do this carefully. What I would say, from having welcomed very much Vika into our lives, and we are genuinely thrilled to have her, this isn't a no-risk situation on either side, nor is it entirely straightforward. I mean, she is an extremely robust and resilient young woman, but she's definitely suffered, even in the week she spent under fire in the war. And she's also very aware of what is going on a minute-by-minute basis, where her mother and grandparents live in Kherson, in occupied Ukraine. And I would also say that host families need to think very carefully about the impacts of having the war played out on a mobile phone in your front room on them. These are real people, these are real difficulties, and I'm really glad that Lord Harrington has grasped this.
All right.
I am sure that our response will be right. We've got 200,000 people queuing up to be hosts. I know that in the next couple of weeks we will make sure that we get those refugees in.
Andrew, I mean, do you think the visa should be waived?
I mean, firstly, credit to Victoria for doing what she's doing, and to the many thousands of other people that have offered their homes for people fleeing the war in Ukraine. I absolutely do. I think we should make it as easy as possible for people fleeing the terror of war to be able to live here temporarily with the support of the whole of the United Kingdom behind them. That does mean there is a huge challenge for government and for local government, because it's not just as simple as matching families up with people fleeing the war. You've also got to ensure that there is the adequate support services for them when they're here, whether that's dealing with mental health, registering with a GP, getting a school place, and so on. So, you know, there's an awful lot of planning that's needed. There is going to have to be resource given to local authorities to be able to deliver on some of these promises. But let's make a success of it. This is Britain at its best.
Right. I mean, the Labour policy has up until now been supportive of the visa scheme.
It has, but I think, I mean, look, there has to be a registration process. There has to be a process whereby you can match people to families, and the local authorities know they're there, absolutely. I just think that we need to have a less burdensome system, make it easier to be able to get people to safety in the United Kingdom. And, you know, the government hears that, and they are doing that. Whether they could do it more quickly, one would hope so.
It sounds like they will.
But it's fascinating to hear you talk about it, though, Victoria. I mean, do you have some concern that there might be actually a lot of difficulties in terms of integration, I suppose, that people maybe haven't thought through, you know, from your own experience? This is not straightforward.
Well, I think people need to think very carefully. Certainly in Vika's case, she views this as a temporary period in her life. She's very much hoping to go back to Ukraine, and with new skills that will, we hope, help with the rebuilding of Ukraine. And we're all trying very hard to view her stay here in a positive light. But for some people, that is going to be very tough indeed. And don't forget that the women coming here with small children will often be leaving the father of those small children in a desperately dangerous situation. And that having it in your front room, literally played out on a mobile phone, is quite a big deal.
All right. I mean, it is, as you say, very distressing for all concerned and all involved. This is the last time you're going to be here with me on this particular occasion for Prime Minister's Questions after your tenure as political editor of the BBC. And, of course, we've loved having you here. It's been nearly 7 years. I can't quite believe it's been that long. And so much has happened in that time. I mean, I don't know if we can rewind briefly and the changing political landscape.
Well, the week after I started this job, or about a fortnight after I began, Jeremy Corbyn won the Labour leadership for the first time, which sort of delighted a huge number of people who came into the Labour movement, appalled quite a lot of people in the Labour establishment, certainly surprised a lot of them at what happened.
Where were you, Andrew, in that? Appalled, surprised, or
quite a lot of people in the middle were trying to make the best of it, I think. Then, of course, the year after we had the referendum, which again completely upset the political establishment, who hadn't seen what was coming, even though if you were outside the Westminster bubble, it was quite obvious the enthusiasm was absolutely going the other way, almost from the beginning of the campaign. Then the year after that, we had a general election. Then we had this sort of Brexit agonies with Theresa May trying to keep control of everything, but it was, you know, chaotic. And night after night after night, people kind of screaming to each other about Brexit.
Fought out in this studio constantly.
Yeah, fought out in this studio. And also, you know, on College Green, which for viewers who haven't been to Westminster, there's the sort of park between where we sit here today and Parliament. Day after day, that was crammed with protesters from both sides, screaming at each other, screaming at us, screaming at you, no doubt, as people were trying to make things work. And then Theresa May was eventually forced out. Then we had another general election.
I'm exhausted
Boris
already.
Johnson, yes, so I'm a bit tired after all of that. And then, of course, as soon as Boris Johnson's massive majority was secure, he was, you know, at last in achieving his ambition of seeming like king of the world, then the pandemic came in.
Within 3 months.
Within 3 months,
and
which
he himself,
shut the country
of course,
down, for nearly 2 years, and then of course now, as we've just been talking about, you know, war on continental Europe, which is something that way back in 2015 no one would have contemplated, even looking at what happened in 2014 and what Vladimir Putin had been done then. So I suppose the beginning, a more benign time, and then a lot of chaos, a lot of turmoil. But I also think an era, actually, when people have really
engaged in politics.
Yeah,
yes,
you know,
in a way. I know lots of people said it turned them off for all the Brexit debate, but I think a lot of people did actually switch on to
massively
politics in terms of the
because
debate.
we've all been arguing. You guys have been arguing over massive questions of identity, questions about Britain's place in the world, and also we've had, you know, people who like to style themselves as being on the outside of the political debate prospering. So whether that was Jeremy Corbyn or, you know, Boris Johnson, who, you know, claims somehow he's anti-elite, but that whole narrative around Brexit, they're sort of trying to topple the elites.
And also there was a sort of shaking of the foundations of left and right and,
totally.
you know, what described Conservative and Labour.
That's right. You know, the Tory party has been in power that whole time. But my goodness, it's a very different Conservative party. So much has happened, and the biggest thing probably is we're all wandering around with these things, and technology has changed how politics
never away from our ears. I'm not going to ask for any forecasts because I think that's
I gave up on that a long time ago.
Thank you very much to our guests. That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.